She lit the cigarette right in my kitchen like it was hers, without asking, without even looking my way. The smoke rose slow, but the disrespect hit me fast. I told her calmly, no smoking in my house, and she rolled her eyes like I was the guest. I waited for my son to say something, anything, but he stayed quiet. An hour later, he pulled me aside and said, "You're creating tension, Mom. Maybe it's time you move out." I stood there, dish towel still in my hand, feeling the weight of his words sink straight through my chest. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask why. I just nodded, walked to my room, and started packing. That night, I didn't just pack my clothes. I packed every piece of myself they thought they could dismiss. If you're still here listening to this part of my story, thank you. I know there are a million things you could be doing right now, but you chose to sit with me for a moment, and that means more than you think. I wonder where you're listening from, what your room feels like, what memories sit quietly in your corners. Sometimes I imagine someone out there, maybe across the country, maybe just down the street, nodding along because they've lived a moment like mine. And if you have, if someone once made you feel like your presence was a problem in a space you gave everything to, then I hope you'll tell me your story too. I read every message, every little note tucked into the comments like whispered truths, and I carry them with me. I don't tell my story for pity. I don't want sympathy. I tell it because silence kept too long can bruise the soul, and sometimes all it takes is one voice cracking open the quiet to remind another that they're not alone. So if any part of this feels like your truth, speak it. I'm still listening. I'm in my mid-60s now, a retired nurse with more years behind me than ahead, and I've learned how quiet a house can feel when the walls forget the sound of your name. I was widowed early, too early, when my boy was still small enough to crawl into my lap after a bad dream. Still soft enough to call me mama, with both hands clinging to my sleeve. I raised him alone, through shifts that blurred into sunrises, through nights I stitched his clothes by hand, because the money just didn't stretch. And through days I packed his lunch with leftovers I couldn't afford to miss. We didn't have much, but what we had, I gave. I made sure his shoes fit before I ever bought my own, made sure he had birthday cakes with his name on them, even when I had to trade a day's work for the flour. We had our little traditions. Fishing at the creek just outside town, Saturday pancakes no matter how tired I was, and those little care packages I sent when he went off to college, always with a note tucked inside reminding him that no matter how far he went, there'd always be someone waiting for his return. I bought that house when I turned 42, after years of saving and second jobs. It wasn't fancy, but it was solid. It had a porch that caught the morning sun and enough space to let him grow without bumping into his past. It was never meant to be mine forever. I built it for him, so he could feel safe, feel proud, feel rooted in something steady. And for a long time, he did. Then came the girl. At first she was polite, even sweet. She helped wash the dishes, asked questions about my recipes, laughed a little too loud but brought flowers once. I thought maybe she was good for him. Maybe this was someone who would remind him how to smile softer. But slowly, almost like a fog rolling in, her kindness turned to comfort, and her comfort turned to control. She started walking through the house like she owned the walls, left her shoes in the hallway, answered the door like she belonged there. And somewhere along the way, I noticed the warmth in my son's eyes started to fade, replaced by something distant, something careful, like he had to check the temperature of every moment before he could speak. And I kept telling myself it was a phase, that maybe I was just too sensitive, too protective, too stuck in how things used to be. But deep down, I knew. I was no longer part of the picture they were trying to paint. I had become the frame they were trying to remove. It happened on a Sunday afternoon, the kind of quiet day where the house hums with the smell of something simmering, and the light from the window touches everything just right. I had just finished seasoning the stew, wiping my hands on the dish towel I'd used 1,000 times, when she walked in from the back porch with that look. Bored, impatient, like the world hadn't moved fast enough for her. She leaned against the counter, pulled a cigarette from her purse, and lit it. No hesitation, no glance in my direction, no pause to ask, just a flick, a spark, and the curl of smoke rising like it had every right to be there. She exhaled right over the stove, like my kitchen was just some hallway she happened to be passing through, and I turned to her slowly, not angry, not loud, just still. I said, "Please don't smoke in my house." That was it. Simple. Calm. But she rolled her eyes deep and wide, with that sharp breath that people take when they want you to feel stupid without them saying a word. "It's just a cigarette," she said, like I was being difficult, like the space I had fought for and paid for didn't deserve the smallest respect. I waited for him to say something, even a word, even just his name spoken in warning. But he didn't look up. He sat on the arm of the couch, scrolling through his phone, like the moment wasn't happening. And in that instant, everything shifted. The room that once held birthday candles and Sunday breakfasts now held silence and smoke, and I realized I was the only one in that kitchen who still remembered what it cost to keep it clean. I turned back to the pot, stirred it gently, but something inside me had already changed. It wasn't the cigarette. It wasn't the smoke. It was the way she acted like she belonged more than I did, and the way he let her. Later that evening, after the plates had been cleared and the silence had settled like dust in the corners, I stood alone at the sink, my hands in warm, soapy water, scrubbing the last dish that no one bothered to thank me for. The kitchen was quiet, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional laugh from the living room, hers mostly, loud and sharp, like she had already measured the space and decided she liked the way it echoed. I was wiping down the counter, slow, steady, trying to find my breath in the rhythm of the cloth, when I felt him step behind me. He didn't speak right away, just hovered, as if he wasn't sure whether he was coming to help or to wound. Then he spoke, barely above a whisper, but the weight of it landed like a door closing. "You're creating tension, Mom. Maybe it's time you moved out." I stood there, still, the dish towel in my hand, my back to him, staring at the clean countertop I had wiped more times than I could count, the same counter where I once lined up birthday cupcakes, sorted bills by paycheck, pressed fevered foreheads, and taught him how to mix pancake batter on sleepy Saturday mornings. My hands didn't shake. My heart didn't race. But something inside me went quiet, like a light being turned off from the inside out. I didn't turn around. I didn't ask him to explain. I didn't cry, though everything in me wanted to break open. Instead, I nodded slowly and said, "I see." Because I did. I saw it all. I saw how comfort had become convenience, how love had become negotiation, how the same walls that once echoed with his footsteps now stood witness to my dismissal. That was the moment I realized I wasn't home anymore. I had become a guest in the very place I sacrificed for, the very space I once filled with lullabies and prayers, now reduced to someone else's inconvenience. I stood there until I couldn't anymore, until my hands felt cold despite the warm water, until my heart felt too heavy to carry all the way back to my bedroom. I dried my hands slowly, placed the towel gently on the rack, and walked past him without a word, because there was nothing left to say that he hadn't already decided. I closed the door to my bedroom and leaned against it, not because I was tired, but because the weight of that sentence was still pressing on my chest like it belonged there. I stood in the quiet, looking around the room that had held me through so many seasons of life, and it was like every object had a memory sewn into it. The quilt at the foot of the bed, hand-stitched one winter when I couldn't afford heat and had to get creative with warmth. The lamp on the nightstand, bought second-hand when he started reading chapter books and needed light to finish his stories. The dent in the closet door from the day he practiced slam dunks with a soft ball because we couldn't afford sports equipment. This house, this home, it was never about the walls or the floors. It was never about square footage or paint colors. It was about safety. It was about making something out of nothing and giving him a place to grow, without fear, without hunger, without wondering whether tomorrow would leave us behind. I remembered the day I signed the mortgage alone, no second signature, no partner by my side. Just me, 2 worn shoes, and a pen that barely wrote. I worked doubles at the hospital, overnight shifts that stretched into mornings, skipped meals so he wouldn't have to know what it meant to go without. Wore the same pair of shoes for 3 winters in a row just to keep up with the bills. I sold my mother's wedding band to cover the down payment. I buried every exhaustion I had just to raise him up. And now in this house built with the bones of my sacrifice, I was being told I didn't fit anymore. That I was the discomfort. That my presence made things tense. I stood by the window and watched the outside world. Watched the trees sway like they had done every year I sat beneath them, praying I'd made the right choices. And I knew then, in that stillness, that I couldn't stay where I was, no longer seen as a gift, but as a burden. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just opened the closet, pulled down the old suitcase I hadn't used in years, and began packing. I folded the clothes I had mended more times than I could count. I wrapped up the sweater I wore on his high school graduation, the same one I wore the day we moved into this house, when he turned to me and said, "We made it, Mama." And somewhere between the folded shirts and the shoes wrapped in plastic, I realized I wasn't just packing to leave. I was packing to protect the last of me they hadn't yet taken for granted. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked around one more time, letting the silence say what I wouldn't. That night, I didn't sleep. I just packed. Quietly, carefully, like someone leaving a place they once called home, but now only calls them trouble. I sat in the dark for a long while after the last shirt was folded, suitcase zipped, and silence took its place across the house like a second skin. I didn't leave because I was angry, and I didn't leave to make a scene. I left because something sacred in me had been bruised too many times under that roof, and staying any longer would have meant letting that bruise turn into something deeper. Something unrecognizable. The house was still. She had already gone to bed, and he was somewhere in that back room, unaware that the very walls he now walked through were about to feel different, come morning. I stood at the kitchen counter and placed a manila folder down right in the center, gently, like it carried a truth too heavy for my hands alone. Inside that folder were papers, copies of every utility bill I had faithfully paid over the years, the electricity that kept the lights on while he studied, the gas that warmed his showers through the winter, the water bill I covered every time she left the faucet running like it didn't matter. And stapled to the front was a signed letter, simple, final, and clear. I had contacted the landlord earlier that week, something in me knowing, maybe before I wanted to admit it, that the tide was turning. The lease was no longer in my name. I had it all transferred over, step by step, with the dates finalized, the payments cleared. The rent? His now. The responsibilities? His now. I even included a note with contact information for the plumber, the electrician, and the trash pickup, just so they'd know who to call when the real weight of a home started to show. I didn't write anything dramatic, nothing harsh, just the truth. That the house was never his, never given freely, but held gently under my name, as a loan, a gesture from a mother who wanted her son to feel rooted without knowing the roots were planted with years of sacrifice. A loan from someone now deemed too tense to belong. I walked through the house one last time, not to linger, but to honor it. I touched the hallway wall where his height had been measured with pencil marks, now painted over but never forgotten. I passed by the bathroom where I used to place warm towels on the radiator so he wouldn't feel the cold after a shower. I glanced at the corner of the living room where his first Christmas stocking had once hung from a plastic hook, and where I spent nights knitting scarves until my fingers ached. And as I stood at the door, hand on the knob, suitcase at my side, I whispered a goodbye that no one would hear but the walls. I stepped out without slamming the door. I didn't need to. Some doors once closed speak louder in their silence than any shout ever could. I didn't take much with me, just a small bag, the folder already left behind, and the truth, which weighed nothing but carried everything. The truth that sometimes love doesn't leave with anger, but with clarity. The truth that I had given him more than a house. I had given him history, comfort, a chance. And now he had all of it in his hands, no longer hidden behind mine. The weight of that choice would come later, and not in the way he expected. But for now, I walked away knowing I hadn't left out of bitterness. I left with nothing but the truth. The next morning, I sat at my sister's kitchen table, sipping warm tea from a chipped mug we'd passed between us for years. The sun was slow to rise that day, peeking through the curtains like it too was unsure of the new beginning it had to witness. My suitcase sat quietly in the corner, untouched, because I had barely slept, and there was nothing left to unpack but breath and quiet. I had left my phone on the counter overnight, screen down, volume off, because I didn't want the world tapping me on the shoulder too soon. But when I picked it up, it lit up like a storm. Missed calls stacked one after the other, all from the same number, with voicemails marked urgent but left unopened. There were messages too, short, confused, some demanding, others laced with a tone that pretended not to be afraid. And before I could scroll through the last one, there was a knock at the door. Sharp, 3 times, like someone unsure if they were asking or accusing. My sister looked at me, and I nodded once. I already knew who it was. I walked to the door and opened it slowly, not with hesitation, but with the kind of calm that settles in after the storm has already passed through. He stood there, disheveled, his voice low but laced with panic, eyes darting past me like he expected to see the rest of his comfort standing somewhere behind me. "Why would you do that?" he asked. "Why would you just leave?" I didn't answer right away. I let the silence sit between us like the 4th chair at a table no one invites but always shows up. Then he said it, and it was the way he said it that told me he still hadn't understood, still hadn't listened. I thought this was our house. I breathed in slow, not to calm myself, but to give myself space to feel the truth settle before I spoke. "It was," I said, "until you told me I wasn't welcome." He blinked, stepped back slightly like my words had weight. And they did. They weren't meant to hurt, just to hold up a mirror. He started pacing a little, hands on his hips, eyes glancing at his shoes, then back at me. "I didn't mean it like that," he said. "She said you were upset, and I raised a hand gently, and he stopped mid-sentence. "It's all right," I said. "You were honest, and so was I. You asked for space. I gave it. You wanted peace. Now it's yours." He didn't know what to say after that. He looked smaller somehow, not in height but in understanding, like the world had shifted under him, and he wasn't sure where the floor had gone. I didn't reach out. I didn't offer a hug or an apology to smooth the edges. I let the truth breathe in the space between us, because it had waited long enough. He stood there for a while longer, hoping, maybe, that I'd invite him in, or ask him to sit or explain something that would make it all easier to carry. But I didn't. Some lessons don't come with cushions. They come with echoes. And that morning, he finally heard the sound of a door that didn't need to slam to close. The day after he showed up at my sister's door, with confusion in his eyes and a voice full of what-ifs, the sky opened up to a soft drizzle, the kind that doesn't make a sound when it lands but still finds its way into the fabric of everything it touches. I stood by the window in her living room, watching the rain draw little paths down the glass, and I wondered how long it would take for the ache to settle, not to leave, but to fold itself into something I could live beside. I wasn't looking for answers. I wasn't waiting for anyone. But somewhere deep inside me, I kept turning the questions over like worn stones in my pocket. Had I gone too far? Had I misunderstood? Had I really become the one causing tension in a home I built with love? That afternoon, when the rain had stopped and the sky softened into gray, there was another knock on the door. This one wasn't rushed or sharp. It was gentle, almost thoughtful, like the person behind it knew what kind of moment they were stepping into. I opened the door slowly, and there she stood. My neighbor from across the street, a woman I'd nodded to for years over hedges and garbage bins, someone who never stayed long enough to know my business, but always greeted me with a smile that said she noticed more than she let on. She had a plastic container in her hands, something warm inside, steam pressing against the lid. But it was her eyes that stopped me. They weren't hurried or filled with questions. They were steady, soft, knowing. "I saw everything," she said quietly, almost like a confession. That night, I was out on my porch, heard enough to understand what was happening. I didn't say anything right away. I didn't know I needed to hear anything from anyone, especially not someone who had never been inside my home. But she reached out and pressed the container into my hands like it was more than food, like it was a gesture stitched with understanding. "You did the right thing," she said. "I watched you hold that house together for years. Always gentle, always steady, and the way she looked at you, the way he let her, I just wanted to tell you. You weren't wrong." Her words sank into me in places I hadn't realized were still tender. Not because I didn't believe in what I did, but because sometimes you carry yourself through a storm so long, you forget that someone else might be watching. Someone who saw how hard you tried to hold the umbrella over people who never once reached to cover you back. I invited her in, not because I needed company, but because for the first time in a long while, someone had offered their presence without asking me to prove why I deserved it. We sat in the kitchen, two older women sipping tea that had gone lukewarm, and she listened, really listened, as I shared pieces of the story. I didn't tell it for pity. I told it because my chest was too full to carry the weight alone. And she nodded through all of it, not shocked, not gasping, just understanding in a way that blood sometimes refuses to do. She reminded me of something I'd forgotten along the way, that strangers can hold space where family has dropped silence, that kindness doesn't always wear a familiar face, and that sometimes it takes someone on the outside to point out the cracks that the people inside keep pretending don't exist. When she left, she didn't hug me or say too much. She just looked at me, touched my arm gently, and said, "You're not alone." And in that moment, I realized I wasn't. Not really. I had spent so many years believing that strength had to be silent, that survival meant swallowing every hurt and smiling through it. But her words reminded me that validation doesn't always come wrapped in shared bloodlines. Sometimes it walks across the street with a casserole and a heart that saw what you couldn't say. That day, I felt my spine straighten a little more, my breath come easier, and the walls around my heart loosen their grip. It didn't fix everything, but it reminded me I wasn't crazy. I wasn't bitter. I was just done pretending I hadn't noticed the change. And that's where strength starts, right at the edge of what you can no longer ignore. The apartment wasn't much to look at when I first stepped into it, just a small second-floor space with beige walls and creaky floorboards that sang under my steps. But there was something about its emptiness that felt honest. No smell of smoke clinging to the curtains, no tension simmering in the silence, no unspoken rules floating in the air. Just space, quiet, blank, waiting. I stood in the middle of that little living room and let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding since the night I left. It didn't matter that the window looked out onto a parking lot instead of a yard. It didn't matter that the kitchen barely had room for 2 chairs. What mattered was that everything inside it belonged to me. Not just the keys in my hand, but the air itself. The peace that lived in the corners. The silence that asked nothing of me. I unpacked slowly, box by box, not because there was much to unpack, but because every item I set down felt like a declaration. A book placed on the shelf was no longer just paper. It was a statement. I am still learning. A photo on the nightstand wasn't just memory, it was proof. I have loved, deeply and well. The first mug I pulled out, the one with the small crack along the rim, found its place beside the kettle, and every cup of tea that followed became a soft return to myself. One cup at a time, I stopped apologizing for the space I took up. One cup at a time, I began to speak to myself with kindness. No one rolled their eyes at my voice. No one sighed when I entered the room. There were no eggshells to tiptoe over, no glances exchanged behind my back, no quiet wars waged through silence and side comments. I bought plants, 3 at first. One with thick green leaves that stood tall like it had never bowed to anyone. One that needed a little light and a lot of care. And one that just made me smile with its crooked stems and stubborn spirit. I named them quietly, like new friends who would never interrupt when I spoke. I watered them in the mornings, sometimes singing under my breath, and watched them grow day by day, leaf by leaf, just as I was doing. They didn't bloom overnight. Neither did I. But together, we stretched. The apartment walls started to feel warmer, not because of the weather, but because I had finally made a home that didn't ask me to shrink to fit inside it. I hung up wind chimes by the window, the kind that caught the breeze and gave the room a little song, and every time they rang, I smiled. Not because they were loud, but because they were gentle and unashamed. I filled the place with scents that reminded me of the mornings I used to enjoy before everything got so heavy. Lavender, cinnamon, fresh lemon. I found joy in simple things again, folding laundry while a radio played softly, sitting by the window with the sun on my lap, reading a chapter out loud just to hear my own voice. My voice. Not tense, not difficult, not too much, just mine. It took me a while to admit it, even to myself, but I was never tense. I was just tired of shrinking, tired of biting my tongue so someone else could stretch theirs, tired of pretending that being walked over was some kind of noble sacrifice, tired of being called difficult just for asking for decency. And in that small apartment, surrounded by my plants and my peace and the quiet joy of being able to breathe again, I remembered who I was before they started naming me as the problem. I didn't need much. I never had. But what I needed most, respect, stillness, a place to be fully myself without having to fight for the right, I finally had. And I wasn't giving it up again. Not for a name on a mailbox. Not for a seat at a table I was always expected to set but never invited to speak at. I had reclaimed my peace, one cup at a time, and I held it with both hands, careful and sure, like something I had earned. Not with noise or revenge, but with quiet truth and a steady, unwavering no. It was just after I finished my tea when the knock came. I opened the door and there he stood, my son. His voice was low, his eyes unsure. The bills, I didn't think you'd really leave it all in my name. I didn't say much. I just looked at him and said, I always handled it. You just never noticed. He shifted, like he wanted to say more, but I didn't give him the space to twist it into something softer. Responsibility smells stronger than smoke, doesn't it? I added, quiet but clear. He nodded, barely. I didn't scold. I didn't explain. I simply closed the door, slow and calm, because I had already said everything that needed saying. I sat down afterward, tea still warm in my hand, and let the silence stretch. Not heavy, peaceful. And if you've ever been called difficult for setting a boundary, or made to feel like your presence caused problems just for existing, I hope you hear this and feel seen. I wasn't too much. I was just tired of being overlooked. If you've ever walked away not to be dramatic, but to finally protect your peace, then this story is yours too. Comment below if they ever made you feel like the tension in the room, when all you wanted was to be treated with care. And if you've ever had to leave to feel whole again, subscribe, because I'm not alone, and neither are you. Thank you for watching. See you on the next video.